All right, let's go. Welcome to all of you. I'm Jeff Baker. I direct the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine. I want to welcome all of you to the 2024 McGovern Prize Lecture at Duke University School of Medicine. So the McGovern Prize honors individuals who have, quote, made outstanding contributions to the art and science of medicine. And it's really, I think, hard to think of a speaker who better represents that combination than our speaker tonight, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who is a psychiatrist. Okay, who is a psychiatrist, writer, and literary scholar. He is going to also, I want to go ahead and announce that besides our talk tonight, he's going to be giving a talk with discussion tomorrow afternoon with a theology and the arts program in Goodson Chapel, 1245 Goodson. Get that right, Jeremy? It's a conversation with Dr. Jeremy Begbie, who is also going to be a very stimulating person to chat to. So that's going to be really good as well. I felt inadequate to introduce Dr. McGilchrist, and I have actually invited Dr. Frank Nealon to do the introduction, do a proper introduction. Dr. Nealon has been at Duke since his internship year in 1962. He is now an emeritus professor of medicine, a very gifted and critical writer. I've known him for a long time. Frank, you don't remember this, but my roommate hit you in the head with a Frisbee in Duke Gardens when I was a medical student. He's been here a long time, and I'm making that point because Dr. Nealon was a champion of humanities in the School of Medicine when almost nobody else was, almost. And he founded the Oster Literary Roundtable. He played a central role in leading 2 conferences in poetry and medicine. So he really, that word pioneer gets overused, but he really belongs in that category. And it was Dr. Nealon who introduced me to Dr. McGilchrist's work. It's not easy to get me to read 800-page work. Dr. Nealon prodded me a number of times. So actually, I would like Dr. Nealon to introduce Dr. McGilchrist. Dr. Nealon.
Well, it is a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. And I want to begin by telling you how I think it is that we got him here. And it began decades and decades ago when, as an undergraduate, a classmate implored me to read the poetry of Wallace Stevens. And out of sheer perversity, I refused to do it. But when at last I opened the book of collected poems, I was amazed to hear Wallace Stevens speaking directly into my ear. Not this ear, but this ear, or maybe this ear. And that phenomenon has repeated itself on occasions since. Certainly 12 years ago, when another friend told me that I should read a book by an author that she just heard interviewed on NPR. That book was The Master and His Emissary, and its author, Iain McGilchrist. And that started my campaign, although it was a very easy one, to get Dr. McGilchrist here tonight. Iain McGilchrist was the elder of 2 brothers born to an English mother and a Scottish GP father in Yorkshire, England. He won a scholarship to Winchester College, after which he matriculated at New College, Oxford. He graduated with high honors, as we might say in this country, majoring in English. I guess there they call it reading English, but we think that's what we do all the time. After his time at Oxford, at the New College, he was awarded this very prestigious fellowship at All Souls College. An honor that my friend and colleague Gopal says is only slightly higher than being inducted into Valhalla. He not only had that fellowship, he was able to train in medicine, pursuing a career in psychiatry, was a practicing psychiatrist for some of that time, also took a fellowship in neuroimaging, a research fellowship at Johns Hopkins. And all along, throughout this time, he has been contemplating the fact that the human brains, in fact, the brains of really all living organisms, are bilaterally similar, but in fact, functionally and anatomically different. And the question is what those differences mean in terms of how brains work. And throughout all of his training and all his career, he has continued to contemplate that question of what does it mean to have two different halves of a brain. The result of all that contemplation and a great deal of scholarly inquiry has led him to the next large book, which is a 1,400-page, 2-volume work entitled The Matter with Things. In encompassing McGilchrist's take on what it means to have a left brain and a right brain that take radically different views of what you may superficially think of as reality. So we're fortunate tonight to have Iain McGilchrist focus all that preparatory work and all its attendant insight on his talk with us tonight, a medicine more fit for humanity. Iain McGilchrist.
First of all, can you hear me? Am I switched on? At least technically switched on. Good. Well, it's a great honor to be invited to speak here at Duke and to give the John P. McGovern lecture. I've been very kindly welcomed here, and I will do my best to convey something of the magic that I feel around the subject that I've chosen to study for the last few decades. In the 3rd century, the philosopher Plotinus asked the fundamental question, but we, who are we? A searching question, especially in our times when no one seems to have the foggiest idea who we are, what the world is, and what we're doing here. And it's a particularly important question for anyone involved in the professional care of our fellow human beings. There are many ways to approach an answer to this question, but one of the most important right now is the seemingly obvious apophatic answer: we are whatever machines are not. However much people may be led to believe that we are machines, it remains a fundamental error. It has often been said with considerable insight that medicine is as much an art as a science, and goodness knows it's very much of both. It's the most fascinating of all sciences, the science of conscious beings capable of having souls. It is also uniquely positioned in the humanities as the way of understanding and responding to humanity's flesh and blood. Perhaps it's fitting that I came to the practice of medicine by a circuitous route. Or it may just be an aberrant gene, as my father was a physician and so was his father. My father even tried not to become a doctor, but it was no use, and I too failed dismally to avoid the fate. I started out with a family prejudice in favor of science. Both my grandfathers were scientists, and I was encouraged by them to immerse myself in science. But since my teens, my greatest preoccupation has always been with philosophical questions. And science, as I was taught it, seemed to ignore them and instead major on technical matters. I made my escape into the open arms of the humanities, where I was enwrapped by everything I learned. I went to Oxford and studied literature, my first choice, philosophy, being wedded to politics and economics, neither of which had the slightest allure for me. How I came to medicine is a slightly unusual and somewhat philosophical path. I had been studying literature and I wrote a book about it, my experience, called Against Criticism, which, if you're in the field and have a secure academic career ahead of you, is called Shooting Yourself in the Foot. But in any case, I wanted to express what I found was wrong with the way in which we approached literature. And to cut a very long story short, I thought that what had happened is that living human beings before us had left organisms behind. Aristotle calls the work of art an organism. So something like an individual person that was birthed by an individual person and speaks to me, an individual person. And this thing was both unique in that it couldn't be replaced by anything else in the cosmos. It was implicit. In other words, all its power and meaning came from the way in which it made things present to us implicitly, whereas if they're stated explicitly, they become nothing. So, for example, when Hardy was bereaved in 1912, he wrote these wonderful poems, 1912 and 13, on the death of his wife. You may ask me, what do they say? Well, they say that when you lose somebody you love, it's very painful. But I can hear that down the pub every night. But that won't substitute for his poems, which are absolutely brilliant, unique expressions that bring so many things together in a way that explicit language can't. And the third thing about them is that they were deeply contextual. In other words, everything, I believe, is altered by its context. Sometimes I tell a joke about American cereal packets, which goes like this. There are 4 sizes. One is jumbo, which means very large. Then there comes economy, which means large. Then there comes family, which means medium. And finally, there is large, which means small. So context can change anything's meaning depending on what surrounds it. And since everything is what it is only by the connections it makes with everything else, we don't live in a world of bits that have to be put together. We live in a world that is a seamless flow of connections, and things that stand out in it we call a thing. I noticed that thing and that thing, but they all live in that connection. So I was unsatisfied with this. I wrote this book, and I left the world of Englit and all that, because I realized that the problem was the mind-body problem. And I went to all the philosophy seminars, and I just thought the philosophers are just too disembodied in their approach. I wanted to do this, must do it in a more embodied way. And around that time, Oliver Sacks had published Awakenings, which seemed to me a model of how medicine should be done. Respect for the individual, seeing and reproducing for the reader the quiddity of the individual, but also being able to see, along with that individual, various great general truths about the way the brain and the personality and the lived life relate. And so I set off on the long process of being a first-year medical student and working my way up, and then becoming a qualified doctor and doing work in a neuro centre, and then went to the Maudsley Hospital in London, which is a big training ground for psychiatrists and also has a neurosurgery and neurology arm to it. And I was intrigued, I won't go into the whole story, but I was intrigued by some things I heard about hemisphere difference. I've been told, of course, as all of you have been told, that everything to do with hemispheres is rubbish because it was all pop psychology and it was exploded in the 1990s at least. But because we got the answer wrong, saying that the left hemisphere is reasonable and reliable and down to earth and unemotional, and the right hemisphere is sort of all over the place, but basically deals in pictures, this is very wrong. The left hemisphere is not reliable. It's profoundly unreliable. In fact, I'm not the only person, but at least 2 other neuroscientists I know have called the left hemisphere on its own deluded. And in fact, the syndromes in which delusions manifest themselves, and there are many fascinating ones, and I go through them in the first part of The Matter with Things, are almost always caused by deficiencies in the right hemisphere, almost never by deficiencies in the left hemisphere. So what we needed to do was to look at these differences in a new way. And again, to cut an extremely long story short, what I came to realize, and this is not contested by any neurologist I know of anywhere in the world, is that the difference is one of attention. So after a right hemisphere stroke, patients are often said to have a pathological narrowing of the window of attention. But more than that, they have a particular use of that attention, which is to get things. So they're intent on getting things, controlling things, and they see only things that stand out as objects of use. Maybe to eat, maybe to build shelter, maybe to make a tool, it doesn't matter. But after all, the right hand, the left hemisphere's tool, is the one with which we manipulate things and we grab them and we get them. So important is that all neurological networks, neural networks that we know of, going back 700 million years to Nemesis stellavectensis, a sea anemone living off the Isle of Wight, all of these networks are asymmetrical. Why? And why on earth would they develop into separate substrates for consciousness, as they have done in higher animals? There is a band of fibers at the base of the brain called the corpus callosum. Only 2% of neurons actually cross it. Of their message is inhibition. They are functionally inhibitory. And I wondered what this was about. It seemed that two things needed to be kept apart. And just to add a little icing to the cake, there wasn't a corpus callosum until mammals came along. The hemispheres were just separate. So there's something here that required answering, and I started research into what the real differences were. And in a way, they devolve on this question of attention. And I didn't immediately understand how central that idea is, how very important it is. I just thought I'd been trained to think of attention as another cognitive function. But hello, it is not. It is the way in which we dispose our consciousness towards the world. And it makes a huge difference, both to what we find in the world and to who we are, we who do the attending. It changes the phenomenological world. So, if I may summarize very, very briefly, the sort of differences in the phenomenological world sustained by the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, it's something like this. So remember, the left hemisphere is looking for a thing that it wants to grab quickly and deftly and use. So its attention produces a world full of things that it already knows what they are, and it knows that it needs them. Things that are certain and fixed for the time being, static, frozen so that they can be grabbed quickly. Explicit, abstracted from context, disembodied, general in nature, and reduced to its parts. Because it's fragmenting whatever it looks at. The wholes that are the only things that really exist are always fragmented into parts. And we use the word part because we're used to looking at machines. But really, parts are only wholes at another level of vision. So what's the right hemisphere's world like? Pretty much the opposite of this. A world in which everything is fresh, unique, never fully known, never finally certain, but full of potential. You could say the left hemisphere narrows down to a certainty, the right hemisphere opens up to a possibility. It understands that context changes everything, all that is implicit, that nothing is ever merely static and unchanging, but flowing and radically interconnected. It understands that parts are the left hemisphere's invention. And its world is an animate one. You can investigate this now quite painlessly by using a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which, depending on the frequency of the impulse, can either suppress or enhance the underlying cortex. And if you suppress areas of the left hemisphere, principally the left frontal lobes, and enhance the right frontal lobes, but also the right temporoparietal region, you get people who see things that we would normally consider merely inanimate as animate. For example, the sun moves across the sky, brings warmth and relationship. Whereas they may see, if the opposite happens and the left hemisphere is enhanced, they may see people as machines or zombies. And that, of course, is one of the ways in which now a lot of philosophers, scientists, and public figures speak about the human condition. And the final thing I want to draw attention to is that the left hemisphere looks only at a representation. A representation means presented again after it's actually no longer present. So the right hemisphere sees, is aware of, takes in, not just sees, but but allows to come into being something for us that is a living world. And almost immediately our left hemisphere has taken over and said, oh, I understand that picturesque landscape that you're looking at, which initially inspires awe. It's a picturesque landscape. I put it in my box of romantic pictures. So it's very difficult for us to escape this categorization that the left hemisphere produces. And effectively, it's producing a map. There is nothing wrong with a map. A map has very little information about the world in it. Very, very little. But that doesn't make it a bad map. That makes it a good map. If it had too much information, it would be useless. So we need a map. But the mistake is when we believe we live in the map. And I would say that's where we now are. So attention changes the world. It really does. There's a mountain behind my house. Its name in Norse means the sloping rock. What that tells you is that Norsemen coming down about the year 1000 down that part of Scotland used the sloping outline of the mountain behind my house as a landmark that told them here was a treacherous bay. But the Picts who lived in the shadow of the mountain, for them it was the home of the gods as well as physical shelter from storms. And in the 18th century, people came there and drew it. For them, it was a many-colored, many-textured form that was very beautiful. In the 19th century, people got more interested in geology, and it just happens to be an exceptional example of columnar basalt formation. In fact, it's contiguous with the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. There's a straight line that runs across, and that's where that formation comes into the world. For a speculator, therefore, it's dollars. For a physicist, it's 99.99% empty space, and the other 0.01%, we don't really know what it is. Now, which of these is the real mountain? None of them is the real mountain. They are all real. They are just the products of different takes. And if you take a clinically detached view of the world, you become a very sterile, isolated person who finds it very difficult to relate in any kind of deep empathic way with life and its sufferers who are all around us. So attention has the nature of love. In fact, Louis Louvel, an early 20th century French philosopher, said precisely that love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. And Simone Weil said that it was the rarest and purest form of generosity, and that what people crave is, in fact, attention as much as anything. It is a form of love. But it has very down-to-earth applications. So as a psychiatrist, I made sure I had no computer on my desk. I took discreetly handwritten notes, and patients sometimes said how lovely it is to talk to a doctor who's not staring at a screen. There are problems with checklists, with structured questions, because they seem to the patient unreal. They seem mechanical. They seem as though you're not really paying attention to them. You're just trying to fit them into a box you've already decided on. And so I think there's great risks to all these things. And speaking of risk, in the profession of a psychiatrist, there has to be a risk assessment because everybody's dead frightened of being sued. And if you haven't done a risk assessment, you're vulnerable. But we now know from research that they are 100% useless. They're no better than anybody's guess. And yet we carry on doing them and making people feel less than human. My risk assessment tool was an untrained nurse who'd been on the ward for 40 years and had very good insight into people. And she'd just say, I'm not very happy with Mrs. So-and-so this morning. And I'd go and see her. She was dead right. What then is a doctor? When my grandfather was a doctor, there were only 6 effective cures in his medical armamentarium. Rather than giving out potions, he and his fellow doctors ministered to their patients and they gave of themselves. To heal literally means to make whole, and heal, hail, whole, and holy all come from the same root. There's a message there. In the US, medicine is a second degree, which is more sensible than in Britain, where you can embark on medical training straight out of school, if you have the right high qualifications in chemistry and biology, and before you really know anything about life. But most often, those first degrees are, I believe, in science. I think ideally all practicing physicians and surgeons, i.e. those who are not merely research orientated but deal with real suffering people should ideally have a background in philosophy or literature. Too many doctors are amazed and even seem a little hurt at the very idea that the body is not a machine and a patient is not a faulty mechanism. Believe it or not, in the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures for 2013, the UK's flagship science series, according to its website, aimed at aspiring young scientists, a distinguished Oxford biology lecturer used the very specially human act of two people gazing at one another to impress on her indeed impressionable audience of 11 to 18-year-olds that you're amazing. We're all amazing because we're all hugely complicated machines. Perhaps it had slipped her mind that machines are not social beings, that they don't have consciousness, feelings, personality, will, or individuality, that they have no appreciation of music, dance, poetry, art, or nature, that they do not fall in love and have no sense of humor, and they do not have the ability to change their minds, and have none of our capacity to sorrow over the past or project a delighted future. And that's not even taking into account the far more complex issues entailed in human consciousness, including imagination, morality, creativity, the capacity for spiritual awe, and allegiance to beauty, truth, and goodness. And in case that should sound the slightest bit rarefied, I'd like to mention that they don't have bodies either, and they do not die. It is true, of course, that you're amazing. We're all amazing, but it's precisely because we're not just hugely complicated machines. If we carry on talking like this to the aspiring young, we will get no better scientists than we deserve. In reality, nothing in the entire universe is like a machine, except the few lumps of metal we have made in the last few hundred years. And that may surprise people, but neither the inanimate world nor the animate world are well explained by thinking of them as machines. Philosophy is intrinsic to science, and I'm afraid that philosophers rather look down on science as though they didn't have anything to learn from it. This is a big mistake. And scientists rather neglect philosophy because it will slow them down on their race to the next discovery and perhaps an honor. But they were never originally separate until the term science started to be used in the sense it's now used, about 1830. Science simply meant knowledge, and that's its central meaning. And the philosopher Iain Whitehead, who I think is probably the most important philosophical voice in the last 100 years, says the antagonism between science and metaphysics has, like all family quarrels, been disastrous. So there's been an impoverishment of science and philosophy by the estrangement. Now, in physics, that changed 100 years ago. About 1890, people thought physics would have to fold up shop because they discovered everything that was going to be known and there was nothing more to do. Then suddenly, a bombshell dropped. Nothing mechanical about the inanimate universe at all. And this meant that physicists had to open themselves to philosophy in order to understand what they were seeing. Not so much in biology, though John Haldane and his son J.B.S. Haldane, as well as Conrad Howell Waddington and Ludwig von Bertalanffy, saw that organisms were complex systems. That is not the same as a complicated machine. Not just a kind of clock, not just a serially operating series of stimuli. It was a very complex system in which there were re-entrant, self-referring loops, and in which intrinsically we couldn't know the outcome. Not because we didn't know enough yet, but because it was actually impossible to know precisely, to determine exactly what that system would end up doing. But molecular biology, which arose around the time of the end of the war, turned the clock back, and life scientists saw themselves as engineers. Now, the highly distinguished microbiologist Carl Woese, whose work revolutionized biology, wrote, "Biology today is no more fully understood in principle than physics was a century or so ago. In both cases, the guiding vision has or had reached its end, and in both, a new, deeper, more invigorating representation of reality is or was called for. A society that permits biology to become an engineering discipline that allows that science to slip into the role of changing the living world without trying to understand it is a danger to itself." And he concludes in a resonant image, "Molecular biology could read notes in the score, but it couldn't hear the music." Now, this is an exciting time for biology, I believe. There are a few spirits who are very much at the forefront in their field, and I particularly mention here Michael Levin, a developmental biologist at Tufts University, who is a very hard-nosed conventional scientist, but has been forced by his researchers to realize that we don't understand a great deal about how organisms work. Somehow, the very notion that an organism, even a single cell, could be likened to a machine is impossible. A single-celled organism, and this was something that Barbara McClintock realized going back to the 70s and 80s, and she received a Nobel Prize for her work, that a single organism can develop an intelligent response to a crisis that it cannot be prepared for either by evolution or by that cell's previous experience. And this is immediately brought online, not 2 billion years later, after random things have been tried and eventually we find the answer. No, the crisis happens on Thursday. On Friday, there's the answer. Now, this is exciting and important, and it suggests to me, as it does to Michael Levin and to many other biologists now, such as James Shapiro at Chicago, that single cells have intelligence. If intelligence is being able to find a novel way to answer a hitherto unknown problem. And there are lots of examples. This is very obvious in plants, but it's also, as I say, obvious going all the way down to a single cell. And just to mention some of the ways in which life is nothing like a machine, you can switch a machine off and you can hope to start it up again 5 years later. You can't do that with a living life. Also, we model machines on systems that are very close to equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium. And that's one of the reasons why they can be switched off and restarted. But life is always at a very long way from dynamic equilibrium. And it is not in stasis, as a machine is, until set in motion. Everything living is always in motion. And we think that a cell, for example, is static because we're used to seeing diagrams in textbooks and microphotographs. But if you actually look at a cell, and you can see the membrane almost disappearing and then reappearing again, things going in and coming out all the time. And this is a thing that is constantly changing. In fact, metabolism literally means change. And we can't stay the same without metabolism. And yet metabolism is change. This takes me back to a saying of my all-time favorite and most esteemed philosopher, Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, who said, "By changing, it remains itself." And that is really a succinct version of what biologists are now discovering 2,500 years later. Also, there is nothing about a cell that is non-linear. Understanding seems to come top-down as well as bottom-up. An organism and its environment are not like a machine and its environment. They're not just in some form of interaction, not even a two-way interaction, but interdependent mutual constitution. So the organism and its environment don't just take it in turns to ping-pong backwards and forwards the ball of consequential action. The environment and the organism become what they are in interdependent mutual constitution. And the parts of a machine are not continually changing. That would be hopeless. But in an organism, what we call the parts are constantly building themselves, remodeling themselves, and so forth. And they only come into being out of that embryo by differentiating themselves from everything else, not by adding in a part in any way. They also, unlike machines, organisms have imprecise boundaries, and they engage in bootstrapping, i.e., no machine can generate a code by which it can be constructed at the same time that it itself is coming into being. It requires the code to be already constructed, the instructions to be there for it to be made. But organisms are not like this. Organisms come into being and generate meaning, generate instructions for their own building as they are being built by themselves. And you know, we now, after the heroic effort of decoding the genome, we are faced with the fact that there is almost nothing in the genome. It's 98% of it is what we call junk DNA, which just repeats sequences. I suspect that we'll find later that it's not junk in any sense, but there we are. But the other 2% can't possibly account for all the complexity of constructing an organism. In human gestation, in the mother's womb, a baby develops every minute, on average, 250,000 nerve cells, 250,000 every minute. Now, those nerve cells are not all the same, of course. They all go in different places. If you look at the structure of the brain in any detail, you'll realize that there is an infallible plan here, almost infallible plan. Not too infallible, because nature likes to work with a little uncertainty, otherwise it would get stuck. So there's always a little bit of change, but generally a degree of conformity to a plan. But where is that plan? Where is the imprint that tells the brain what a brain should be? And with certain kinds of worms, you can cut the head off, you can cut it off hundreds of times, you can have the same body generate a new head, and every time it generates a new head, it has all the memories that the original head that's now been incinerated had. How? So beyond all this, we need to be thinking about science in a way different from the way we do. Humanities provide the essential context for science, especially the clinical sciences. The success of the machine model, and it needs to be given due honor. Treating things as mechanical has resulted in great discoveries, but we make the illicit jump from that what we're dealing with is a machine. So in a complex system, we can have something so massively interconnected and related that you can't possibly understand how it works. But if you focus down on a little tiny part of the picture, you can see one arrow leading to another arrow, leading to another arrow. Now, our interventions are at that level. We take a micro step, we change something, and it has a result that we can predict. But that doesn't mean that the thing is at all like a machine. It's not a complicated system, it's a complex system. Whether one goes upwards or downwards in scale, one finds that machine thinking no longer suffices. There's a trade-off between truth and utility, which is also that between the dispositions of, respectively, the right, more veridical but more complex, and left, less veridical but simpler hemispheres. We are nothing like machines then, even when viewed from the outside. It's also that the interiority of the human subject cannot be excluded from the picture. This, however, is something that science, for entirely understandable and useful reasons, forbids. So science can do much, but little at all in bringing us to an understanding of a human life. Science is based on the idea that we're not going to take into account purposes or values, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing to set out as the basis, the axioms from which you work. But it's no good at the end of that saying, we pronounce that having looked everywhere, we find no purpose and no values. I mean, that would be like a policeman stopping the traffic in the street and then writing solemnly in his notebook, the silence in this street is very suspicious. So this is the problem. All is in process. We are processes that flow. Indeed, as Heraclitus said, everything flows. And we are whirlpools in the stream. So I see each living being as being like a whirlpool in the stream. For a while, it's there. You can photograph it. You can measure it. It can move stones. It's real. But after a while, it moves on. Now, was the whirlpool in the water? Absolutely not. It wasn't in the water in a way a ball would be. It is the water. It's just the shape the water takes for a while. And then the water moves on, and the water is still there. And that is who we are. We are whirlpools that are for a time in the stream, And we have our day, as it were, as a whirlpool, and then we go into the larger flow again. There's a contrast here between a world of pieces that are static and separate on the one hand, and a world of flow and seamlessness on the other, where there's no such thing as stasis and division, only relative stability like that of a river, and relatively distinct features such as the eddies in the stream or the waves in the sea. David Tong, professor of theoretical physics at Cambridge, writes, "I see no evidence whatever for discreteness. All the discreteness we see in the world is something which emerges from an underlying continuum." So he's saying there is a hierarchy here. At the base, there is only the continuous, but the whole business of the evolution of the cosmos is making distinctions. This idea of multiplicity within unity gives rise to a different understanding of death. It's not that the machine stops, it's that the water moves on. Why are we so afraid of death? My view is that there are only two possibilities. Either there will be nothing or there will be something. If there's something, I'll be fascinated to know what it is. If there's nothing, I won't be there to be disappointed. So it's not something to fear. Mary Midgley, a philosopher who was both a friend and somebody I greatly admired, lived to a great old age, about 96, and when she was 92, she wrote a thing saying, "I don't worry about death at all. When you think that you might be condemned to a universe in which you could never get rid of yourself, you would always, always, forever and ever be yourself." It's appalling. And it sets up fear in the heart. And so the question is only when. And I think the normal portion size is about right, having reached it, and living on borrowed time. And so I see life as a gift. Any more time is good, and if there isn't, then fine by me. We live in a world in which quality is no longer the important factor. Quantity is, but quantity is a very bad guide to what is valuable. And I say this, death is not the opposite of life, but its end and fulfillment. The opposite of life is not death, and not even inanimacy. It's mechanism. And here I refer, I haven't got time to explain this, to the biologist and mathematician Robert Rosen, who wrote a book called Life Itself, and a slightly more penetrable book called Essays on Life Itself. But his general thesis is that there is no huge divide between the inanimate and the animate, but the inanimate is a version of things that does what life does, but very, very, very slowly, and only to a tiny degree. So things in the inanimate world respond to forces, and they move, and they change, and they develop. But what life does is both do this billions of times faster, but also to a very much higher degree. It can respond to value. And I believe the ground of being is, whatever it is, part of that ontological primitive are values such as beauty, goodness, and truth. And the reason there is life, which is a very costly process, if you ever ask yourself why there should be life at all, is in order to respond. As Whitehead said, if you want permanence, the secret is never to have been alive. A rock can live for millions of years. Once you have life, it's both very expensive in energy, and it doesn't last that long. There are actinobacteria at the base of the ocean, single examples of which are 500,000 years old. So if evolution is all about achieving permanence, it hasn't gone the right way about it. Instead, I believe it's about resonance, responsiveness, the business of relation. I believe everything that exists is primarily relational, and that's not an extremely outsider position. I believe that relata are the product of relations, not the source of relations. Anyway, I'd love to talk more about that, but I can't. Medicine's not only about bodies, but about people. Immediately we're outside the field of science alone. Nor are bodies, for that matter, simple at all. And matter is not simple at all. I always say materialists, at least the ones that believe that it's got nothing to do with consciousness, are not people who overvalue matter. They're people who undervalue matter. After all, if you take the really hard-nosed position that matter has nothing to do with consciousness, it's something very remarkable, because after a few million years, it gives rise to Bach's St. Matthew Passion. That means that matter, pure lumpen matter, that you've defined as having nothing interesting about it, does some very interesting things. You haven't solved a problem, you've just specified one. So core to being human is attention and intention. Machines can neither attend nor intend. The greatest influence on John McGovern was the Canadian physician, Sir William Osler, and he was an important figure in my medical education too. And his most important legacy was the insistence that students learn from seeing and talking to patients, and the establishment of the medical residency, that is to say, the doctor literally living in hospital alongside the patient. His best known saying was, "Listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis." In my day in medical school, machines were considered tangential. We were taught to pay attention, to listen carefully to the patient's story and ask questions, to observe, and at that point we should have made the diagnosis. Only then should we lay a finger on the patient in order to confirm what we suspected was the case. And investigations came last of all, solely to firm up the diagnosis for the notes. So solving problems is not exactly what we're there for. A machine can be fixed, but a person can't be fixed. A computer can solve a defined problem, but most human problems are not that easily defined at all. Relationships, including the doctor-patient relationship, are essential to what is going on in medicine, whether you realize it or not. Though a computer can undoubtedly aid a surgeon, there it is rightly treated as what it is, a tool. It's non-relational. It has no emotions, no body, and cannot suffer or die. But awareness of all this is at the very core of medical practice. Relationships, as the sine qua non of fulfillment in life, are important with three main elements, and we know this from a mass of socio-psychological research. The three things that make people feel fulfilled and make them happy are the sense of belonging to a coherent society that shares beliefs and practices and that they can trust and share their lives with. That's the first. The second is closeness to nature, not going for a walk with headphones and improving your physique and looking at your phone, but actually just being there and for one moment to be just aware of the wondrousness of what it is you're looking at. And the third is with the spiritual realm. I'm sorry for those people who think something terrible about the idea of a spiritual life. I can't help, but I'm just reporting the evidence. Don't shoot the messenger. The evidence is stronger on the last of these than on either of the other two, but they're very important. And they have effects on the whole of life. Psychological life, of course, but also physical health. So that, in fact, belonging to an engaged community of people who worship together is more effective than losing weight, stopping smoking, and going to the gym 3 times a week. Not that you shouldn't do those things, I'm sure, but I'm just pointing out that life is not as simple, bodies are not as simple as we sometimes assume. And these effects are on all, both cognitive, emotional, moral, and physical life. Our fragmented, life-denying, grasping culture is making us sick, sicker than we have ever been. And if we're to heal and make whole again, something very different is required. As Einstein said, we can't get out of the crisis by the same kind of thinking that got us into it in the first place. So we've been commodified and commercialized by a capitalist society. Curiously, here there is a toxic alliance between capitalism and bureaucracy. Both hate one another, but they're both doing the same mindless left hemisphere work, both in their different ways, driving utility alone. And as Lessing pointed out in the 18th century, those who believe in utility have to answer the question, utility for what? If the answer is just more utility, you have a problem. It's got to be utility for something beyond utility that might be something like, I suggest, goodness, beauty, truth, or the sense of the sacred, things that have disappeared from our lives with devastating consequences. It's pretended now that doctors, teachers, nurses, clergy provide a product, rather than embody sacred duties towards others. Hence it is that their expertise must be replaced by blind rule-following and their codes of ethics, which no machine could understand, replaced by administrative procedures. Unfortunately, administrators don't seem able to understand that either. To allow otherwise would be to admit that mechanism is not everything, and that people in their lives cannot be, as they say, operationalized without loss. How grave those losses are, we're only beginning to recognize. We have worse to come, I fear. At the very least, if we carry on relying on machines, doctors and healthcare workers will become de-skilled. Patients will be disaffected, and they will be over-investigated. Scanning normals leads to chance findings. We often find lumps and bumps and growths, and when you don't know what they are, you're obliged to investigate them. Most aren't cancer, but they lead to investigations, biopsies, even operations, which are always unpleasant, sometimes harmful, and occasionally fatal. This process leads not just at times to physical harm, but to false reassurance and inevitable anxiety. And although Daniel Kahneman suggests that skill in professionals is overrated, I take his evidence to pieces clinically in the matter with things. And I'm sorry to report that the papers that he cites say nothing like what he takes them to mean. He probably hasn't looked at them for about a long time. And they say, in most cases, exactly the opposite. They are in praise of the developed skill of a professional. And the Dreyfuses have written about this, that there are different levels of skill. In the first three, most primitive levels, having an algorithm helps you. But when you get to be an expert, having algorithms actually impairs your ability to do the job. And so we end up with mediocrity instead of excellence. And this is true of pilots as it is of surgeons. And unfortunately, science is important, and entirely legitimate claims on truth risk being compromised if they're hijacked by the left hemisphere refusal to acknowledge the limitations of its chosen model of representation, here the machine model. So how can we move forward? How would a paradigm shift, for example, towards a model of a human as part of the ever-moving, shared stream of life change the way we thought of ourselves, influence, in other words, how we answered Plotinus's question, who are we? It would change the way we relate to one another, to our ancestors and to our progeny, to past and future generations, as well as the wider world, human and non-human, in all its complexity, the world where we live, out of which we arose and to which we return. But it would also, quite simply, help us avoid viewing ourselves as machines, the most crippling possible distortion of what it means to be a human being. Any astute clinician knew long ago that our attempts to view complex biological systems as machines was a dangerous delusion. But now even researchers realize that the model has signally failed. Unfortunately, our errors are compounded by the fact that scientific research into the human being, and specifically into the brain, is almost exclusively carried out using the model and the language of the machine. Neurospeak is replete with references to wiring, circuitry, modules, switches, signals, data banks, inputs, outputs, and to the brain encoding, computing, and having mechanisms of every conceivable kind. And no one knows better than I do from personal experience how hard such terms are to avoid given the existence of the culture. Yet Wendell Berry is surely right when he says that we should banish from our speech and writing any use of the word machine as an explanation of or definition of anything that is not a machine. The language used is hugely important. It determines what we can understand. And there's a lovely passage which I haven't got time to read from the physicist David Mermin, who independently as a physicist says what I, from a philosophical point of view, say, which is that relations are prior to relata. He actually uses those very words. But he points out that the writing of science has become incredibly tedious, abstract, impersonal, and such that only somebody with an extraordinary willingness to endure endless tedium can read their way through scientific papers now. But in the 19th and early 20th century, scientists wrote beautifully and personally about their findings. And anyway, I've spent a lot of time reading and translating the works of neuropsychiatrists in the 20th century, in the first few decades of it, French and German, and in them lie much of the gold dust for those of you who really want to understand the relationship between the brain and mind. So partly the problem is the neoplastic growth of reductionism in science, and partly the surgical excision of adequate education in the humanities at school, which might have helped sophisticated, not just writing skills, but insight into what we're actually doing when we practice medicine. So let's go forward with a few resolutions for a future medicine that's both more human and more humane. Let's begin from education. We're fallible human persons dealing with the fallible human person. Knowledge of great human achievements in the humanities and some knowledge of history and philosophy would not only make us better at understanding human life and human suffering, but bring a reliable lifelong source of sustenance when we may be spiritually starved or distressed, not unimaginable episodes in a physician's life. It would also induce a certain humility that would issue in being better physicians. We have expertise, but expertise is being denigrated. It's not mechanical, rather the fruit of hard work, intuition, and experience. And though our expertise importantly includes much information, it goes well beyond that, or should do. No one can be comforted in facing death, their own or that of a loved one, by a machine programmed to mouth platitudes. May our treatments be as free from harm as possible. Above all, do no harm. You know the words. This should mean embracing therapies, both physical and psychological, that are effective without necessitating medical intervention in every case, though not an unthinking abandonment of what medical science has bestowed, and for which I am personally and professionally very grateful. It may also mean consigning some treatments to history. It means paying attention to, at its simplest, making eye contact with the living being in front of you, not the screen of a computer. Proper attention is healing in itself. It shows respect, induces trust, and gives birth to a relationship which will sustain our patients, and I might say ourselves, whatever we can or cannot do for them. Never see death as a personal failure, and know when to desist from what are called heroic measures. The true hero is the one that respects limits in the name of compassion. And remember to be kind to colleagues and not forget a sense of humor. These are no small human achievements when under stress, which is inevitably where one often finds oneself. Kindness and humor are friends of common sense, and while they cannot be offered by machines, I fear they're being driven out of our world by too many grim, straight-faced, life-denying mechanical rules, protocols, algorithms, and procedures. No, machines can never be like people, but I worry that people might be becoming more like machines with every passing day. We need courage, we need imagination, and we need resolute adherence to the values that matter most. In the words of that great psychiatrist, neurologist, and Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl, let us say yes to life in spite of everything. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good.
So we're going to, in a minute, have some time just for some general questions. But given that a lot of this is connected to neuroscience, and a lot of you don't have a neuroscience background, we thought we would open, if you invite the two of you to have a conversation together. So this is Dr. Lynn White, who is a neuroscientist. He directs the brain and behavior course for our medical students. And he does a lot of very interesting work where in his teaching of neuroscience, he brings up concepts and that are best understood from the perspective of the humanities. And I thought we would just have a little bit of time to let the two of them dialogue together, and then I'm going to invite questions from the audience after that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker. Thank you, Dr. McGilchrist. It's an honor and a privilege to share the stage with you, even for just a few moments. And for the benefit of the audience, As a neuroscientist, I would like to exercise some privilege and focus my questions primarily on the foundations of the ideas that you mentioned in the first 10 or 15 minutes of your lecture today. Those ideas that comprise the first part of Dr. McGilchrist's seminal work, which I trust is familiar to many of you in the audience, The Master and His Emissary. So I'd like to begin by turning our attention to one of the very first points you made, which is that the human brain has evolved to sustain necessary and seemingly paradoxical contingencies. On the one hand, cooperation, but on the other, competition.
Exactly.
So please help us understand, how is this possible? How can cooperation and competition simultaneously characterize the relationship between the cerebral hemispheres?
Well, first I'd say that they're a principle in nature altogether, so that the story of evolution is usually presented in a very one-sided and very left hemispheric way. The left hemisphere is very keen on competition, but the right hemisphere is more interested in cooperation. And indeed, species that survive are not those who have ruthlessly won their way to the top, but those who learned how to collaborate with other species. This is a very well-established finding in evolution. And so we wouldn't expect the human brain or any part of the human being to abjure either one of these. We need competition, of course. It's very healthful, as long as it doesn't become terminal. And we need cooperation. And the way in which the hemispheres relate is complicated, but there is this difficulty that the left hemisphere is definitely about getting something ahead of somebody else, grabbing that seed if you're a bird precisely so that you get it before one of your conspecifics. But the right hemisphere is looking out for the whole picture, for predators that may be eyeing you up as you're eyeing your lunch, and for your kin, for your mate, for your offspring. So these collaborative and cooperative ways of being are there. But the story of the master and his emissary, which is after all only a metaphor, suggests that the master, the right hemisphere, appointed an emissary because it knew it needed the emissary. It didn't want to compete with the emissary. It wanted the emissary to do healthful work that would benefit the both of them. But the emissary, knowing very little compared with the master, and that is not just a kind of image. It's true that, and I unpacked this for 400 pages in the beginning of The Matter with Things, the right hemisphere knows a great deal less, understands a great deal less, and is much less reliable on reality than the right hemisphere. But knowing so little, it thinks it knows everything. And this was the famous Dunning-Kruger effect, that the more you know, the more you realize how little you know, and the less you know, the more you think you know it all. And so I can think of some prominent voices in science who think they know it all. I shall make no further comment.
Well,
but in the way they, sorry, just to finish, in the way they relate, it is true that the right hemisphere communicates more promptly and more with the left hemisphere than the left hemisphere is willing to communicate in the opposite direction because it's more internally directed. So the actual structure, the neuronal structure and architecture of the right hemisphere is more diffuse with more connections but, around the hemisphere than the left hemisphere, which tends to concentrically focus attention within certain areas. So once again, this detailed, narrow focus thing just causes more narrow focus, whereas the right hemisphere is always going, but what is it I don't know? And therefore, it is not to return to the whole, to have nothing to do with what the left hemisphere sees. To return to the whole is to see that both of them are needed in the way the right hemisphere understands. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you. And for the benefit of the audience, if any of you are curious to unpack some of the biology of how the two hemispheres relate, I'm sure either one of us would be happy to speak with you following the reception or during the reception. But I did want to follow up on your response to this question because it leads quite naturally into an important progression of being that you articulate, which is a progression of right, left, and then right.
Yes.
And that progression provides a coherent way of understanding oneself, the world and one's place in it. And I'm wondering if you could say more about your experience, perhaps clinically or otherwise, about the consequences for the integration of self in the world when one or more stages of that progression, right, left, right, is compromised
Yes.
or underperforms.
Well, much the most common failure of that sequence is the failure of the left hemisphere to report back to the right hemisphere, if you like. And it's very helpful to be able to analyze things. I'm always told I have an analytic mind, and I did a lot of legal work and so on. And I don't have anything against my left hemisphere. It's my second favorite hemisphere. And I wouldn't be doing very well in this conversation if I didn't have an articulate left hemisphere. But it's just when it thinks it's the boss. And the image I like to use is that of learning a piece of music. So initially you're attracted to it as a whole. That's the right hemisphere, which is much more musically orientated. But then you start to practice it, and you realize you have to break it up into parts. So passages that have to be repeated mechanically until you master them. And you know, when you think about it, about the harmonic structure, and you see here we return to the tonic and all this kind of thing. But when you go out on stage to perform, you must forget all of that completely. Otherwise, you give a terrible performance. This doesn't mean that the time was wasted. It just means it's had its day, and we now need to return to the whole that's been enriched by what the left hemisphere gives. Now, this is a metaphor, a parable of what we should have but don't have in our society. So we think we understand things simply by taking them apart. As though instead of understanding a motorbike by getting on it and riding it, you understood it by taking it painstakingly apart and leaving the nuts and bolts and everything on the floor and going, well, search me what this thing is. It doesn't seem to have any meaning or purpose. And that's how we view things now. We don't see the whole. So that's what I'd say about that. And in medical terms or psychiatric terms, what happens is that people with right hemisphere deficits, first of all, are more power-seeking and controlling than people with left hemisphere deficits. And they're anxious if they're not in control. So the left hemisphere gets paranoid if it doesn't have a grasp of what it is. It might bite me, I don't know what to do. So it has to be in control all the time, whereas the right hemisphere understands that you don't need to be in control of everything all the time. And in fact, for life to progress at all, you have to accept degrees of uncertainty. The other thing that happens, and this is evident in both schizophrenia and in some kinds of autism, is that people see things mechanically. They see things not with emotional and social intelligence, but as if they were mechanisms that were being inspected as if from another planet, and one had to work out how they did things. So there are lots of examples that I quote in a chapter on what schizophrenia and autism can tell us, where people say exactly this, that they try to work out, why did that person say that thing? What do they mean by it? Because they have to revert to sort of rule-based learning, because they have no intuitive, embodied understanding of how human beings work. And so you need this awareness. And in the most alive kinds of culture, a lot of what is said is not made explicit. And it may be part of the fact that America is a melting pot. That when I went to work at Hopkins, and I'm sorry, this is probably will sound disrespectful slightly, but I don't mean it to be, but it was a genuine cultural difference. That I learned after a few weeks of saying things, and people were looking at me in a puzzled way and going, really? And I say, no, not really, but never mind. But I hadn't realized how much of the way in which I normally talk is indirectly, ironically, and not just stating it as it is. And I think the whole of society is drifting more towards everything has to be made explicit. And nothing that we value is explicit. Love, sex, neither of them are good when they're explicit, frankly. Religion, music, theatre, narrative, poetry, art, ritual. All these things have to remain at an intuitive, non-implicit level to have their power. It's like explaining a joke. once you've made it explicit, it just isn't funny.
Well, in reading your work, there were so many instances where you had written a sentence that just stopped me dead in my tracks, and I just had to put the book down and reflect and contemplate on the meaning of what you've just written. One such sentence I'd like to invite you to tell us more about is the following. One could call the mind the brain's experience of itself.
Yes. Did you want to go on?
Well, I find that both brilliantly concise, but also tantalizing, and I'd love to hear you say more about what you mean by that.
People sometimes ask me, is there anything I wrote that I'd want to change? That is the one sentence I would want to change. To be fair, I wrote it a very long time ago now, about 18 years ago or so. And I hadn't thought as much as I have in the intervening time about what one can, really that is a worthless tautology which suggests that the brain can be able to think about itself and so forth. But although my view of the relationship between matter and consciousness is not a simple reductive one, I wouldn't want to state that the brain experiences itself. Our mind experiences what the brain enables us to experience. But I suppose at that time I was anxious to make bridges with reductionists because I thought I'd frighten the horses if I said too many things that didn't sound orthodox and reductionist. So I wanted to say, but it's just the brain's experience itself. But this was a moment of feebleness and letting myself down. So there we go.
Well, I can assure you the horses were duly frightened. I'd like to perhaps just ask two more questions, or one more question. Okay, so I'll turn to a thought from someone that I think we both know and admire, V.S. Ramachandran. And he has said so insightfully that one of the basic facts of our being that we so readily take for granted is the embodiment of our consciousness. And I'm delighted to hear you describe embodiment in such rich terms today. Similarly, you credit Merleau-Ponty for emphasizing the importance of embodiment in forming the basis of the intersubjective world. So please say more about the importance of embodiment for consciousness and intersubjectivity.
Well, it's been said with amusing fake precision that we're only aware of 0.56% of all the activity of the nervous system. And however you look at that, it's true that we're not aware in the sense of being focused on things that our bodies know, that our brains know, that our nervous system knows. And when I was in medical school, you know, we recognized that there were nerves to the heart, and there were these efferent nerves that go from the brain to the heart, telling it what to do. But unfortunately, there were a lot of afferent nerves going back from the heart, reporting to the brain. This was a bit of an embarrassment. What are they for? They can't be for telling the brain something. So instead, they were just reporting pain. But that's not, I'm afraid, the full story at all. And then, of course, there is the fact that the gut, our human gut, contains more neurons than the brain of a dog. And a dog is by no means a stupid animal. And I can promise you that they're not all there just to help you go to the restroom. So the gut is communicating, the heart is communicating, our muscles are communicating, every part of us is communicating. And this is this idea that is now becoming much more widespread in biology, not necessarily of the human, but just biology of organisms, that distant parts of an organism seem to be aware of the whole situation. Now, this is very interesting to me. And so there's that. Embodied knowledge is both much more than we can articulate and much truer than anything we can put into words, because all the really important stuff is not susceptible to language. Language is made for practical purposes, to enable us to establish a certain relationship with people that's legal or firm, and to be able to say, where is the hammer and when's my dinner coming and all this kind of thing. But it's not terribly good at doing the subtle stuff. And on the whole, when reduced to conducting a relationship with a loved one or trying to do therapy over the telephone, although the words are there, there's so much missing that one feels an intimate feeling of loss, that something important is not there. So there's that. And then there's briefly the idea of intersubjectivity, which I think is a very rich and important idea. I try to distance myself equally from an idea of naive realism, that there's just stuff out there and our consciousness looking at it has no effect on it and also does not alter what it is that we see. Some of us goes into whatever it is we see. That doesn't invalidate it, that makes it something real, actually. But I also don't believe in the sort of postmodern nonsense that we just make it all up and therefore any idea is as good as any other. I mean, for one thing, nobody acts on that. Everybody acts with purposes and values, and they think some things are truer than others. But it would stop philosophy and it would stop science. So instead, I think there is a relationship. There is always a relationship. Sorry to harp on this, but it is. If one thing you should take away is the idea that before there was anything, there was relationship. So that relation, because I think that is God, I think that is divinity, and in most religions God is seen as a force of love. And if love isn't a relationship, I don't know what is. So God is relational. The Trinity shows that. God is related to another world. And there's so much, I could love to give a whole day's talk on theology here, but let me just come back to this point about intersubjectivity, that the base of our understanding has to be an intersubjective one, in which we both, as Wordsworth said, half create and half perceive the world that we inhabit. And that's not something to shy away from. That is a gift, and that's something to celebrate.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McGilchrist. We'll reserve the rest of our time for questions from the audience. Thank you, Dr. Baker.
Thank you very much. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you. So I would like to have some space for questions from the audience at this point. We have 2 microphones in the back. They're actually not disembodied microphones. They're with Nikki and Marjorie, who are really the people who made this event successful. So I just want to acknowledge them too. Yes. Microphone's coming over there.
Yeah, I don't know if this is possible to answer, but
Give it a shot.
I'm a practicing physician at the end of his practice, and I don't know if it's just despair, but it seems that medicine has become increasingly the left brain world, not just from computers, but risk management. And the question is, how do we, or as the right brain journeys into it to connect with the patient, I feel a great sense of despair at how to maintain what you call truth, beauty, goodness, the Platonic ideals or the sacred, as one is consumed with the world that I enter to practice medicine. And this seems to me to be profoundly getting worse and rapidly getting worse, not better, and does not augur well for the patient-doctor relationship.
Well, if you're asking me what do we do, I'm not sure I've got a simple, quick answer. I tend to think that it's important to reconsider the education of physicians, which is one of the things I mentioned. I also think it's important for physicians to think very hard about their use of machines. I don't say don't ever use them. Machines are great tools, but they are tools, and even the ones that pretend to be much more than tools are parasites that are pretending to us that they're something like us. They are not. And the worry is that we defer to machines in taking decisions about human lives and what should be best for this patient. And I think that's the point at which we've gone much too far. So as aide-memoire, as ways of calculating things, the machine is very helpful. Processing data much faster than we can do, but not making judgments about human lives. I don't mean about life and death things, but anything to do with human lives, because they don't know the whole story by a million miles, and we can pretend that they do by putting in language with which they then are told to go and consult and try and speak. But you know, in the 18th century, they had speaking heads. They weren't as good as whatever it is that Microsoft produces now. But really, they're not any different. They're just much more clever at mimicking humans. They're still just mimicking humans. And machines must not be our masters. They must be our servants.
Thank you, and thank you for coming, and it's marvelous to hear you. We seem to be trapped in a world of language which is all left-brain. And it would seem that, particularly of those of us who are in the caring professions, whether it's medicine or psychiatry, ministry, or whatever it may be, that we need to talk more about the language that we use with the people that we care for. What do you have to say to us that helps us kind of reframe language in a way that
Yes.
can take us into a new place in our society?
Well, effectively, there are people who should never have become clinicians, and it's very difficult to teach them. But the ones who should have become clinicians know instinctively how to use language, and trying to give them courses in how to use words will make them appear, mechanical and unspontaneous, and will make them think too much about what words they're using. And once you start doing that, you don't come across as somebody who's genuinely meaning the words you mean. You come across as the result of a very good social skills training course. But that's not what we want. We want somebody that we have that feeling that this is a fellow human being who understands me. It's not rocket science, really. But there are certain things that you can't put into somebody if they haven't got it. This was a point made by Madame de Sévigné in the 18th century, or actually the late 17th century, that if you don't have this understanding in you, I can't give it to you. So I think that it's a bit of a waste of time spending lessons training physicians how to sound more human. Get rid of them. If they can't sound human, they're not human. And you see, and that's why it's very good to have later entrants to medicine who actually really want to do the job, not just that they see it as a way of earning a lot of money and they got very good science qualifications at school.
I want to respond to the other physician in the state of despair. And I think the first thing that I saw fall by the way was clinicians deciding how much time they needed to spend with an individual in order to communicate with them. And it's intuitive, it's natural, and the language problems are not so bad. I mean, even those people who struggle with language, if they have enough time to communicate with other people. So I'm just going back, I'm retired now, I'm going back 45 years, and that's the first thing, that was the first blow to our integrity, that was the first moral injury, was when they decided that we didn't know how much time we needed to spend with each patient. And so I love what you say about the community, nature, and sacred, because I think we physicians have to join up around not how much we're being paid, not on the coding system, not any of that. I think we just have to get together and form a community that can define what the essentials of care are. Thank you.
Well,
I love
thank
your...
you. I don't really know what to say, except I was a bit shattered, actually, when I heard that there were physicians who sort of gamed the system in order to make more money because they claimed a consultation that was longer or whatever. And I'm not sure if you really think like that, how you could really enjoy your job or respect yourself. Much of the joy of being a physician is knowing that you are really engaging with another human being. And the thing that comes from that is irreplaceable. Irreplaceable. And I understand that people work under constraints of time. And because private healthcare in Britain is extremely small part. It's like 2 or 3%. When I decided that I needed to be in private medicine in order to give my patients the time I thought they deserved and make the decisions for them that I thought they should have, I was able to do that. Nobody told me I had only so much time. It was up to me, and I charged whatever I thought was appropriate to the length of the time I'd spent. So I don't know what the answer to it is, but time is one of those things that we now are all short of. And I'd just like to say this, you know, we won't be good at anything. We won't be good at being parents or partners. We won't be good at being teachers or anything if we are always kind of in a hurry, because the good stuff comes without being hurried. It can only happen like that. And good writing has to be like that, as I have, you know, learnt to my cost. If it's been good, I hope it has. But yes, I mean, this is the problem about time. And one of the ways in which I think we're being made time poor is by machines intruding into our lives. So, you know, 15 years ago, I could solve most problems by making a 5-minute telephone call to somebody. But now I can easily spend a whole morning frustrated working through a system that seems totally illogical, doesn't answer my question, has Escher-like self-referring loops in it. And you know, I think, did this never get tested on a real human being? Surely a few minutes would have shown that this is never going to work. And then you have to hang on in order to speak to somebody on the other side of the world who doesn't understand anything about the circumstances where you are, an hour and 40 minutes, and finally you get through somebody who can't solve the problem because they've got an algorithm in front of them, and what you're saying to them doesn't compute. This is the world we have created for ourselves, my friends. It's not working. I mean, wake up to it. We need to get people back into our lives. Also, people need to work. What are we going to do? Just have people sitting around and being paid from the state and having no satisfaction in their lives? If machines take over, there's so much that's going to be wrong. And they're not wise. They're very good computation machines, but people who are good computation machines alone are not wise. A machine that's a computation machine is never going to be wise. But if you have a powerful tool, you need to be wise enough to know how to use that tool. Otherwise, it's like putting machine guns in the hands of toddlers.
We're getting juice. That's good. So I get to play the corpus callosum, and we're gonna in just a minute let everybody go out for a reception. But I want to invite one question from the right hemisphere. I think in the back, the posterior lobe.
Yes, this is working then. Well, I just want to say, Dr. McGilchrist, I came across a video that you gave on Ralston College's YouTube channel about a year ago.
Okay.
And I'm very, very grateful because about 20 years ago, I came across another psychologist who was talking about the importance of right hemispheric dominance. And I'm very grateful because being on the autism spectrum myself, I've learned that by voluntarily choosing to be right hemispheric dominant, I've saved myself from insanity and a complete psychological meltdown. Because I was someone who could be on the computer 16 hours a day and have no desire for human connections. Until I was 13, I didn't have a desire for human attachment. And I've learned through blood, sweat, and tears that we need people, and that when I have the ability to connect to people, the desire increases. When I have the desire to connect to people and I act on that desire, the ability increases. And on top of this, I discovered that if you focus on the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, with all of its abilities, becomes more and more powerful. If we focus on the sun, we get a stronger shadow. But if we focus on the shadow, we get nothing. So I just want to say thank you very much, because what you are discussing, and thankfully at least one other psychologist as well, is the reason I am not dead. So thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I'm moved by that, and thank you so much for saying that and being open about it. And I just want to say that, to my surprise, I have had emails from people who said I was always very left hemisphere dominated, or I am on the autistic spectrum, but reading you has helped me understand things, and I now feel I've changed, and my relationships are happier and better. So thank you. That was very kind of you.
I want to thank you for that comment too. That was interesting. I felt drawn to recognize you. Well, we are going to have a reception outside. There'll be a chance to interact more. Please go out through the doors and the sides initially. The middle door is going to open in just a second. Let's all thank Dr. McGilchrist one last time for his wonderful, wonderful address.
The comments from the audience strike me that there's a whole group of people that were